like to thank the NFL Foundation for their generosity in making this course possible.
Hello, my name is Dr. Shauna Springer, and I'm the Senior Director of Suicide Prevention and Postvention Initiatives at Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, also called TAPS. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this course. In their book, Citizens and Warriors, Secretary of Defense James Mattis and Corey Shockey point out that active duty service members, veterans, and military families shoulder an immense burden of grief that is frequently overlooked. Many service members and veterans are survivors of suicide loss, sometimes multiple times over. A survey by Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America found that more than half of their members knew a post-9/11 service member who died by suicide. Families of service members are often impacted by losses that aren't recognized by civilian society. In this course, we will discuss postvention and why it is important. Postvention is a term unfamiliar to many people, yet it is a critical component of suicide prevention. Postvention refers to actions taken following a suicide that help promote healing and decrease risk in those exposed. In fact, research tells us that those exposed to suicide in the workplace are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide. And with each attempt in a military unit, risk increases. In fact, if 5 suicide attempts occur in a given unit, that unit is twice as likely to experience another suicide than a unit not exposed to suicide. TAPS has served thousands of survivors of suicide loss over the past decade, and in the process, we have developed and refined a best practice postvention model. In this course, we will introduce you to the 3 phases of this model, which include stabilization, grief work, and post-traumatic growth. Suicide loss is very complicated. Survivors are often faced with unique challenges and may struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, relief, and anger, in addition to the grief they are already dealing with following a suicide. For example, consider a mother whose son dies by suicide. She may feel guilt because she has also struggled with mental health concerns herself, or because she feels she should have been able to save him. Her sense of helplessness may be magnified if she feels her son's mental health issues were not adequately identified and treated. Another example is a spouse with several small children who feels rejected and abandoned by the suicide of her partner. These kinds of complicated feelings frequently follow a suicide loss. Because the cause of suicide is multifaceted and complex, helping those who have lost a loved one to suicide is complicated. The most helpful response depends on many factors, including the relationships involved, the mix of emotions that survivors feel, and the nature of available support. For example, at TAPS, we often notice that siblings are overlooked grievers. In many cases, postvention support is focused on the spouses and parents of those who die by suicide. Indeed, siblings are often expected to be a rock for others and may be asked to make difficult decisions about the care of the body and funeral arrangements. In this process, their grief may be minimized or overlooked. It is important to respond to a death by suicide in an intentional, well-informed manner. This helps promote healing and prevents harmful consequences, including subsequent suicide. The most effective postvention efforts address these different experiences and relationships and work to focus support on all those who have lost a loved one. We know that people who have been exposed to suicide are at a higher risk for developing substance abuse disorders and mental health issues, including potential suicidal thoughts and feelings. A death by suicide can affect those beyond the immediate loss survivors and ripple outward, sometimes impacting an entire community. Research tells us that for every suicide, 135 people are impacted on average. There are several reasons this might happen. It is possible for multiple people to be affected by the direct trauma of the suicide itself. Families and friends may also experience overwhelming feelings that can surface after a suicide, such as helplessness, guilt, and longing to be with a loved one. This can add to their devastating grief. Thoughtful postvention supports survivors of suicide by helping identify and address their mental, emotional, social, and spiritual needs, thus preventing further loss. We don't know what we don't know, right? Unfortunately, some of the ways that people commonly respond to suicide can actually do real harm. A military or community leader who decides not to hold a memorial for the deceased for fear that it will make suicide seem acceptable may inadvertently be increasing feelings of shame in others who are suffering. This decision, while well-meaning, could decrease the likelihood that someone will seek help. A therapist who tries to help a survivor get to the bottom of why it happened to alleviate his or her suffering may actually be causing additional pain. Because multiple stressors are typically involved in suicide, not by one person, experience, or event, trying to pin the cause on one situation is not only misleading, but can increase feelings of guilt in those impacted. Religious figures who tell their communities of believers that suicide is a sin in order to deter others from dying by suicide inadvertently induce shame and increase the risk that others will continue to suffer in silence. Postvention runs interference against harmful responses and preserves a safe space for those who are impacted by suicide to begin to heal. For the past 10 years, TAPS has developed and refined a highly effective best practice postvention program. This model combines professional expertise and personal lived experience of suicide loss and the lessons learned from serving thousands of suicide loss survivors. Our model consists of 3 phases: stabilization, grief work, and post-traumatic growth. The first phase, stabilization, organizes the experience of loss to facilitate a healthy grief journey. The specific goals of stabilization are to create a perceived sense of safety and support, complete a trauma and risk assessment, and offer interventions if indicated, and assess and provide specific assistance with suicide-specific issues that may interfere with a healthy grief journey. Grieving is the second phase. The loss of a loved one is an ongoing journey that doesn't have a discrete end. In this phase, there is an intentional focus on helping survivors productively engage in grief work. Specific goals of Phase 2 are to develop a healthy grief rhythm that can be integrated into one's life, to shift the focus from how the loved one died to how he or she lived, loved, and served, and establish a new relationship with the deceased, if desired. The final phase of the model is post-traumatic growth. The goals of this phase are to maintain a supportive presence that is responsive to cycles of grief, such as anticipating increased feelings of grief during anniversaries of the loss, to find a new appreciation for life and/or relationships in honor of the deceased, and to provide opportunities to find meaning in loss by helping others navigate their grief journeys or by living out personal values in other ways. Within TAPS, we provide and facilitate post-traumatic growth by offering opportunity for survivors to be part of the TAPS peer mentorship program, or by volunteering in our events and seminars to help other survivors on their journeys. In addition, we harness the power of storytelling by encouraging those with lived experience to help build insight about suicide, and in doing so, we help prevent suicide. Carl Hillway is an Army veteran who has served for many years as a TAPS military mentor. His personal journey provides examples of each phase of TAPS postvention model. Carl's college roommate died by suicide with a firearm. Carl witnessed this tragedy inside their dorm room and was deeply impacted by the loss of his roommate. He struggled to get out of bed, let alone get to his classes. During a conversation we had for a podcast on the stories behind the story of suicide loss, here is what he said.
It was disabling for me. It really was. It was a struggle to get up out of bed every day. It was a struggle to go to class. It was a struggle to function. And I think had there been some services in place there to reach out that I had known to go to, that it could have made a difference.
Carl unfortunately witnessed many more men die by suicide during his time in the Army. His perceived need to soldier on by himself resulted in an overwhelming grief experience, which he described as feeling like he was drowning. Then he asked for help. He found that lifeline, and through it he achieved stabilization. Carl received the tools he needed to cope with his tremendous losses and advance through the stage of grief work. A combination of peer support, grieving with others who had been impacted by similar losses, and professional therapy helped Carl during the grief work phase of the model. Listen to a piece of our conversation about the grief work phase of his journey.
For me, that mental health help that I received later on turned my life around in terms of my ability to function on a daily basis. And having had the experience of had to soldier on my own at the college level and navigate that on my own without help and create the services for myself and figure it out for myself, and not having that support system made the process of grieving that loss and being, it felt like I was drowning at the river's bottom for months and months and months and even years.
By acknowledging his grief and processing the trauma related to these losses, Carl was able to achieve post-traumatic growth. Listen to how he has been able to draw from his own experience to help others on their journey through his service as a TAPS military mentor. And how do you use your lived experience with suicide loss to really help the children of the fallen who have lost a parent or a loved one to suicide?
I think the biggest tool it gave me was the ability to talk about it and the ability to say to myself, it's okay to express in front of others your own feelings and your own experiences about that suicide loss.
Suicide prevention efforts should include not only prevention and intervention, but also a comprehensive postvention component that reduces risk and promotes healing for the immediate family of the person who has died by suicide. Postvention efforts should also be made available to all members of the affected community, including extended family, friends, co-workers, battle buddies, first responders, treatment providers, and others exposed to the death. Within the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, TAP's Suicide Prevention and Postvention Initiatives has developed additional, more in-depth trainings to support effective best practice postvention strategies. For example, we've developed extensive trainings to help survivors move through grief and achieve post-traumatic growth, as well as methodologies to support spouses who have lost a loved one to suicide. To learn more about TAP's suicide prevention and postvention initiatives, please visit www.taps.org/suicide. Thank you for taking the time to take this course and for your outstanding care and treatment of our country's service members, veterans, and military families.
The Veterans Crisis Line number is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please call 1-800-273-8255 and then press 1 if you or someone you know is in crisis or just wants to talk. If you have any questions or need assistance, go to the PsychArmor website or call the PsychArmor support line at 844-779-2427. Thank you for completing this course and taking that one step further in learning about our American veterans.